Today, I'm joined once again by my friend, default friend, Catherine D. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. I had a special T-shirt made for this particular. I'm going to go back to slouching soon, but do not screenshot this.
I love it. I love it. It's extremely useful. I will need one myself. Yeah, I feel like the screenshot. I think there was like a an episode of The Simpsons where Mo was trying to find a good thumbnail of himself, and I feel like that's just the story of my life. There are none. That's the longest thing. That's why I took my face out of the thumbnails because it's just like 20 minutes of me just like slowly scrolling through and trying to not be deformed. So I just skipped it. I'm like, the guest, this is the guest. That's what you're getting. And my face is the same every time. So why should I why should I torture myself and you? So yeah, I might need that shirt. But yeah, I forgot to say who probably anyone who's watching this, Catherine D. She's been on before. People know that you are the quintessential internet historian. You're a journalist, writer, someone who knows about the darkest bowels of the internet and little secrets about all of these demons that are haunting everyone at the moment. And one particular demon that I want to discuss with you is something almost kind of like a very particularly American malaise. We don't have this in Eastern Europe, or we don't have it in this form at least. It's the school shooter, and you've written about this, and you have some less kind of off the beaten path opinions about what motivates this phenomenon, and it's not more or less guns, too many guns, too few guns, which seems to be the only discussion that's being had. I mean, in your opinion, what exactly is the motor behind this?
I mean, it's nihilism. I don't think anyone really has. Well, for the most part, people don't really have something to live for, um, and it manifests in all sorts of different ways. I see like this sort of chaotic, like senseless violence. It's not that different from people who are like anesthetizing themselves by you know filling their days with they have work, they go to they work themselves ragged at a workout class and they drink wine until they fall asleep. It's just another way to escape that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting angle. I mean, again, that's kind of a direction that really is not really being addressed. I mean, why do you think this nihilism is not like it really isn't a phenomenon that's being brought up? It's not being brought up in this context, and it's not being brought up in the other contexts, like you said, the urban nihilism that we're a bit more familiar with. Why isn't this a factor?
I think people are scared of it. I mean, I think a big thing with school shooters is they people want to believe that they're just monsters, right? And that it's like some sort of an anomaly. Every thousand people are going to be super violent, and it's easier to blame guns than it is to blame something structural. I think there's a kernel of truth in that, right? Um, but I don't think people think of it in the right way. I think this is like, sure, if they are just monsters, this is how that monstrous behavior is going to manifest in a society that doesn't give, especially young men, many options.
Yeah. I mean, one of the school shooters that you've particularly written about is Adam Lanza, who is the shooter in the Sandy Hook incident, which is also a very contested shooting. I mean, there's a lot of conspiracy theories around Sandy Hook, which I don't think is the case for many other school shootings. Like it's extreme. I mean, Alex Jones was essentially condemned on the basis of Sandy Hook. I mean, why is Sandy Hook such a contested event?
I mean, the coverage around it was weird. It is a very weird case. I think that there are conspiracies around every mass casualty event. That's a very American kind of instinct, and it's not even something that's like recent of like the Twitter sphere, right? This it's always been this way. There's always the story that the press pushes, and then like the real story, and the real story, of course, isn't always real. It's usually halfway between what the press has told you and what the conspiracy theorists are pushing. But I mean, Sandy Hook was just so difficult to make sense of, right? It's a horrific situation. it was elementary school students. It was the first time something like that happened. And then the other thing is, because like we have a 24-hour news cycle, there's a lot of flaws, right? The reporting on these issues is always, filled with mistakes and, kind of wonky. But it makes it so much more charged when it's something as sensitive, and as delicate and just as, horrific. We had never experienced something like this before, especially here. Um, you know, we it's one thing if something's happening and it's a war crime or whatever, you become desensitized to it. Um, but to think like, oh, you could send your 6-year-old to school and not see them again was, it was big.
Yeah, and you said that the reporting was strange. I do remember seeing a video of a parent. I think that's one of the more famous ones where I think they were kind of laughing backstage with someone, and then they kind of turned to the camera and started weeping or started crying, and there really was kind of this vibe of is there some like crisis actor element to this? Like I don't know. Even for me, that felt a little bit, out of sorts. Obviously, you don't know how people react in these situations. Who knows exactly what was discussed? There's not a lot of context in it, but it did feel a bit, I don't know, creepy. But in these events, people do tend to kind of pattern match. Like if you expect there to be
Yeah.
something suspicious about it, then you kind of, see this type of footage and you're like, oh my God, this is so suspicious.
This is maybe this is actually like the opposite of a red pill, but like the red pill for me on like which conspiracy theories to trust, has been paying attention to conspiracy theories about myself and how easy it is to make stories out of nothing, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it really is just, it's just the simplest explanation, like, wow, someone's child was just shot, and it could be that they were holding back tears and they want it to be composed, and that turned into laughter. It's for me, it's much easier to throw away the crisis actor stuff, knowing sort of how easy it is to pull together like convincing conspiracies, basically. I read stuff about myself, to make it a little more lighthearted, and I'm like, yeah, I could see why someone would believe it's not true, but I could see how, like, if you have the red string and you're sort of trying to connect all the dots, why you'd believe that. Um, yeah, with Sandy Hook, there's other things too, like stuff getting misreported or people being misquoted, and then it being changed, and then it being taken down. Um, weird footage. It's hard to corral people when like you're going to look at the crime scene. There's like footage of people running away. There was originally reports of 2 shooters. There's all sorts of stuff, and I completely. I in some sense I sympathize with people who there's a lot of distrust in the media. But digging into Adam's digital footprint, this was a troubled person who I think really, it's something that couldn't have been faked, right? The story is too rich. The footprint that he left, that has been totally unexplored, is too complex for it to be somehow faked. And that, that's sort of where I fell on it.
Yeah. That's kind of what you've been exploring. You said it's unexplored, but what have you found about Adam Lanza? What was he like?
He, well, first of all, he started off as a sort of like a hardcore libertarian anarcho-primitivist. Um, and, when we, especially in the United States, when we think of what's the profile of someone who's going to commit an act of violence, obviously we've been fed the story that it's going to be a hard right extremist who's trying to become a martyr for white supremacy or something. That's actually rarely the case, right? None of these guys are martyrs; these are suicides. And I think they're not fighting for a cause. They want to die, and they want to die because they don't think life is worth living. They don't want to die on like the behalf of a movement or something, or for some transcendent meaning. It is precisely because they think there is no transcendent meaning, that they kill themselves in this very horrific way. Adam Lanza is sort of the poster child for this, because so he starts as an anarcho-primitivist, which I'm sure your listeners know what that is. But if they don't, it's someone who's sort of back to the land, an anarchist, back to a primitive society, anti-tech. Um, anti-modernity, but in a very specific, almost sort of like hippie-ish way. And he ends up, saying like, well, even if we returned, even if I got back to my primal self, so sort of like Rousseau, like, thought process, there's really nothing there. Life is just nothingness rather. And he was attracted to this school of thought called Ephilism, right? Which basically that it's life backwards. And it's essentially that life has no value. But then he went even a step deeper, and this is sort of a confusing switch because it's sort of incoherent. But he thought that even Ephilism had some sort of like moral weight to it, right? And he was actually just anti-value. And really what it came down to is he was against culture, against the culturists, as he called them. And he wanted to get to a point where it was, to bring everything to nothing, that living is a form of torture. He was against having values at all, which of course the confusing part is that is a value, right? And yeah, I mean, it seemed if you listen, there's tons of YouTube videos. He made hundreds of posts online. He just did it. It's almost like if people are like familiar with like Ayla's kind of questioning. It's like if you took Ayla and brought that to a conclusion of like life just isn't worth living. And again, that's like really not. I think it's partially not explored because we want to believe these guys are radicalized online in a very specific way. And that kind of goes against it because it's one, kind of difficult to describe, and then two, it's like, well, what do you do with that? When you talk about what the solutions to that might be, you really paint yourself into a corner that kind of goes against everything that American society is promoting right now, which is like, for example, structure. Would Adam Lanza have been a happier, more productive person if he was religious? It doesn't mean that's not a call to like Christian nationalism or anything, but it is like set values. It's transcendent meaning. If he could lean into some identity group that wasn't about victimization, that was about empowerment. Like if he was, it feels corny saying this, like if he was proud to be an American, right? And for a lot of people, I mean that sort of that like philosophical structure is what seems to be missing and what they're longing for. And it's a really difficult thing to talk about, especially, in a world where it's just be endless choices. For some people, that endless choice just ends up at like, fuck it, nothing matters. Nothing's worth it. I'm just gonna, I'm gonna kill myself and kill others.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how important kind of just like little biographical details or maybe big biographical details are to this because essentially it strikes me that Adam Lanza was kind of just like you said a rationalist that really took it to its final conclusion, and he was also someone who was not enjoying his life. He had a hard existence for whatever reason. He wasn't getting along. He wasn't supported by the people around him. His life was grating at his soul up to the point where he said, "Okay, this is all misery, this is all pain, and I'd rather not have it." And for example, you bring up Ayla. I mean, she's kind of on the other end. She seems to be enjoying aspects of her life. She's kind of has a positive experience of some things, and then there is some value in kind of just the utilitarian pleasure of going along with life that offers kind of the substructure that was just missing for someone like Adam Lanza. Like he's not out there, having utilitarian experiences. I can imagine. I mean, just seeing, little details of his biography.
Yeah, I mean his lifestyle, looks very similar to when people sort of imagine, like the prototypical incel, which I actually think is a lifestyle that many of us lead, even if we don't want to admit it. Or it's mostly mediated by a screen. His only exercise was going to an arcade and playing DDR. He had relationships, but they were online. This created a distorted sense of self. He developed anorexia. Um, he was increasingly he might have been autistic. His environment was very overwhelming to him, so he couldn't handle sounds or certain textures. But I've noticed even in my personal life, like that tends to become exacerbated when you are isolated. It just gets worse and worse and worse. So, I also think just that level of alienation um, creates delusions. And the thing, it's so hard to talk about because usually those delusions are relatively harmless, right? They're not murderous. It could be paranoia about your immediate family's politics, right? Or, something like this. Or even I think like COVID safetyism is in part like, it's reinforced by the media, but it's also, it's you play along with it because you have no social fabric to kind of like check you on it. I also think a lot of this is super simple, right? And again, like I noticed in my own life, like the busier I am and the more embedded in a fabric of something I am, the less like actual time I have to think about any of this stuff. The less I want to tweet, the less I want to get lost down these rabbit holes. And I think like we underestimate like the, people already feel like they don't have enough to live for. And then like what's really the problem is not so much like this radicalization machine, it's the alienation at all. And it kind of takes everyone to a dark place. And it's kind of like Russian roulette about like how is that darkness going to manifest? Like I do think there is something very dark about like smoking weed all day, and just wasting away that way. Again, it's like not as harmful, but it is sort of a loneliness and a detachment and being kind of lost at sea in the same way. Just, again, obviously much less harmful.
Yeah, I think people underestimate how much of a question of critical mass this is. It's not like, for at one point this type of lifestyle was kind of optional. You had kind of the loner stoner type that, was always in their apartment, like even 10, 15 years ago, even here, that, would just kind of check out. But now, given that everyone's kind of wrapped up in some form of this, or most people are, you really don't have anyone to hang out with. Like I see a lot of like some of my most sociable people that I knew, the social butterflies are kind of trapped in the fact that they've had like a year or two where they were trying to, cling on to their relationships, but then they just kind of gave up and then they became, addicted to weed or whatever, even if it's not a physical addiction, there's a lot of, psychological components to this. So they're just essentially at their house smoking weed all day and kind of giving up on life. So it's really hard to come back from this if there's no one around to do it with.
I also think people underestimate is you become more antisocial over time too. Like even if you do make the effort, and everyone says like go touch grass or whatever, I think people like don't have the patience or the desire to build physical relationships, with like the one exception being sex. Of course, we're, as everyone loves to tell me, we're in a sex recession. But I do think there are a lot of people where their only outlet for connection or even experience is the sexual experience. And that's where you sort of trick yourself into saying, well, I'm doing something. This is a relationship, but it's not really the same relationship as you'd have with a friend, right? Like it's very limited in scope, and it's also predicated on like this dopamine seeking. It's like the only way we know how to interact. And again, like I see it in myself. Like I've become much, especially after COVID and like as my work moved online, become much less patient and able to feel comfortable, like making eye contact or being like embedded in physical interactions. I think a lot of people do. I think on some level it is an individual choice and you can do it, but if it's reinforced in so many different ways, to expect people to sort of just do it on their own and have the strength and even the self-awareness to recognize that like they're struggling with this and that like they need to just tough it out, I think it's insane to ask of people.
Yeah, and I feel like it really does seem to have, been accelerating with COVID, and like the last 2 years, whatever was going on before that, and these trends were existing, but now it's really gone off the rails. And I can imagine. And I'm not going to say I'm going to predict more school shooters, but the sentiment that fuels that type of activity seems to be flourishing.
I mean, I don't necessarily think it will manifest in real world violence. I really don't know, one way or the other. But I do think it's interesting that when you look at the sort of like political gripes of Zoomers, and this is across the political spectrum, they do. I mean, it's slightly different than the millennial gripe, which is capitalism has, capitalism induced alienation. Zoomers seem to identify the internet. They're like, well, it's so much worse for us because we have only known a world that's mediated through apps. Like forget the commercial internet or even like the pre-commercial internet. Like we've only known life mediated through Tinder and Snapchat and whatever. And there's a lot of anger, and you see some of like the greatest critiques of this from like groypers, honestly. Especially like these like forum groypers, right? And of course they wrap it in slurs and whatever, but it's like they're saying the same thing as like the leftists writing for New York Magazine, and of course one of them says it a little bit more eloquently than the other. I'm no
Just a
subscriber.
parenthesis. Can you define groper for whoever doesn't know?
Sure. So if you're floating in the I'll define it in this way. It's one of these things that's very difficult to put a definition. But if you're floating in the Twitter sphere, especially the right wing Twitter sphere, and you see someone that's like blank groyper, and they have like a fat frog as their avy, right? And there's many different subgroups within this, and there's many different definitions, which is why it's hard to give a succinct one. But they're sort of like the edgiest of the right wing. Of the e-right posters, right? And they're not necessarily the friendliest, but their tech critique, it's good enough for me to risk my reputation to say I think it's as good as like Neil Postman, right? Like, of course they're dropping a couple of N-bombs, and I don't endorse that, unequivocally. I'm not racist, etc. But like they are identifying something real, and they're saying it with a pointedness that their more public facing friends on the left seem to be grasping at, but struggling to say. But they're saying the same thing, which I think is really interesting, just in different ways.
Yeah. Are you seeing any sort of significant, like tangible, real world pushback to technology from Zoomers? Like, are they actually checking out or logging out?
I think there's a dissociation, right? I think they use social media sort of differently than millennials do, much more like walled gardens from them, right? Which is, I think what's going to be interesting, especially for like the internet culture beat, is like you do need to be invited to the private Discord, to the group chat. It's not as public. I think some very privileged Zoomers, it's sort of like déclassé to be so online. But it seems like there's this just like overwhelming sense of like we're dissociated, we're detached, we don't know how to exist, sort of ironically leaning into it in some cases. And you saw the seeds of this, and this is what Angela Nagel writes about in Kill All Normies, right? You see the seeds of this in millennials, but it's really full-throated with Zoomers. It's like that's why people think that sort of like surrealist humor is like endemic to Zoomers, even though it's been online since the dawn of the internet, because it's like the whole generation seems to embody that, like, under 7 layers of irony. It's just there's no real sense of self. They're all kind of, again, like lost at sea is really the best way to put it.
Yeah, and how did this kind of manifest in Adam Lanza? Like you said that he kind of had this nihilistic philosophy, but what were kind of the facets of this? Because I remember I was listening to your podcast on this, and there were aspects of antinatalism was a really big you know word cloud in there,
Yeah.
and even like pedophilia apology. Not necessarily that he was a pedophile, but he was not necessarily averse to pedophilia. So there's kind of a lot of like just interesting side turns that this whole
Yeah.
thing takes.
Yeah. Well, everything was sort of just like downstream of like, if nothing matters, right? If we have, unlimited choices, then like, why should there, any guardrail feels arbitrary, right? Which is why I think if he had, even if he was constantly questioning it, some sort of like, code of ethics, that wasn't the kind of oxymoronic one that he had. He might have been happier, if there was just more again, like structure is just really what it comes down to. I feel like for some people, like you can do anything is like, oh, well, you could do anything, and it's like, of course I can. And it's sort of unlimited possibility. The frontier never ends. And for some people, you can do anything is an immediate stop to the frontier. Like in the incelosphere, the incels love to say it never began, right? Forget it's so over, it never began. And Adam Lanza, for him, it never began, right? Like what's the point of any of it? And I think a lot of school shooters or mass shooters in general tend to think like this, and they'll point they'll point their rage at institutions, because that's the only way they can make sense of it. But if you go through like the online footprints of a lot of people who commit these types of crimes, they all kind of boil down to like everything is meaningless. Like the world is so big that it becomes nothing. Which again is like something, I think that's a theme that's present in your work. And when I saw it come up again and again and again at NatCon, and I think it's a shame that it's vilified. And I wish there was. I don't think it should be a partisan issue, right? Like, there needs to be some sort of vehicle to understand the human experience. You can't just sort of say it could be anything you want it to be. I think it corrupts our software, right?
Yeah. I mean, what you're kind of laying out just seems to me like almost a perfect mirror image to the positive side of rationalism. You have the effective altruist, which this is not, unique criticism, but it's like effective towards what? What values are what are underlying this? I mean, they're obviously couch it in language like it's qualia, it's this and that, and it's essentially just smuggling in Christian morality and then saying, okay, we're just going to, let our free flags fly and do good in the world. But on what exactly do you ground that good? What differentiates it from evil? And it seems like the opposite of this is, yeah, I mean, there is no good and evil, and it's actually in a way a more correct version of rationalism. I mean, they really don't have anything to ground it in, at least not convincingly to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. It's just, and it's weird to me that the conversation around it often, says this is right wing extremism, right? And again, like this isn't a value judgment of my own on right wing thought, but I mean, it's not. It's like the precise opposite. It's kind of crazy to me that that like, because you don't have to dig that deep to realize that's not what this is. Which I thought was like the remarkable thing about this research is, this is all publicly available. Even if you read sort of the analysis by people who, like people who are accepted by the mainstream, you peel like, you take away the preamble about whatever, right? The sort of, leftist veneer. And they're saying this, they're just sort of like, somehow trying to convince the audience that it's something that it's not. It's recently there's been sort of a trend of likening mass shootings to deaths of despair, which is really interesting, right? Well, if it's a death of despair, then it's not political extremism, right? That just it's not. There is no political motive.
Yeah, I mean, are there other school shooters that like echoed the same kind of anti-natalism or similar ideas?
Yeah, there's a long list of them. I mean, and most of them, there's more exceptions, right? Most of them do have this like anti-natalist, like nihilistic, drive. Salvador Ramos, who recently, again at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, he had a very similar worldview. Even the Columbine shooters, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, I don't think that they're quite in the Adam Lanza mold. They are sort of like there where the stereotype actually does kind of become true, because like the sociopaths who kind of were on a power trip. But if you look at Eric Harris's writing, he does rail against, in this very like Charles Manson like way, against like the superficiality of the modern world and of civilization and society. And I think it's interesting that this sort of like anti-civilization sentiment, that is, no matter who you're looking at, that is everywhere, right? This, you know, Adam Lanza is kind of like the apex expression, but it just comes up again and again, again. And if you want to talk about which extremists are influencing people, I mean, the only person who, again, no matter who you could pick, 3 random names from a list. Every single one of them is like, has at least read and considered Ted Kaczynski, which I think again is like, why aren't we talking about our relationship to technology, to our relationship to industrialization? That doesn't mean return, but it means it's impacting people. And if we're going to have a real discussion about it, maybe this is an area that we should pay attention to.
And why do you think there is no real discussion about it? Because this stuff is fascinating. It's gripping. It's definitely it bleeds. It should be leading, and it seems that no one really thinks it's interesting, or they like to focus on other aspects of these things.
Like I said, it's starting to a little bit. I think that unfortunately, this is an issue that's been weaponized. Um, you know, the right wants to say it's all about mental health, which seems is more true, I think, than it's all about guns. Neither one helps, right? Having a mentally vulnerable population that has easy access to guns. Both, I hate to be, what else from default friend than both sides have a point, but you know, that's true, but that's not the root issue, right? It's like if you have an obese population and you just start, and all you talk about is, well, everyone has diabetes. It's like, there's several layers that, like, at some point, like, yeah, get people their insulin, but at some point you have to recognize that they're obese, and then you have to ask, well, why are they obese? And that's something that we have. I mean, this is an issue with American society in general, right? Like, our healthcare doesn't address this. Our politics don't address this. We're very much about treating the symptoms, and the symptoms will escalate. And we're terrible at identifying and trying to fix root causes. And it might just be because it's too difficult. I mean, I certainly don't have the answer. Like, how do we make Americans less nihilistic? You know, that's an incredibly overwhelming question.
Yeah, I feel like that's kind of the main beat for a lot of the kind of the new dissident right or whatever post-liberal space is kind of identifying that the answers aren't really in the dichotomy of collectivism versus individualism, and focus on the individual or the collective, the commies versus the whatever far right. It really doesn't. It that level of abstraction is bankrupt. There's no more discussions to be had at that level. And then when you layer on top technology and you really just sit in your lawn chair and observe how these factors and like influence things and how they've been changing year after year. Like, you remember the world of 10 years ago, and you've been involved in all the technologies that have happened since, and you realize what's going on right now. Like, most of the social issues and the even in your life and in my life and the people around me have something to do with this technology. And the explanations that you need more individual responsibility, or you need the state to intervene more to whatever bail people out of their misery. uh, they're just band-aids at best on some deeply rooted problems that actually, and I think you're right about this, and it is a really scary thing to consider, might lie at the heart of essentially the political project and the philosophical project everyone's been involved in for the last few hundred years. And it's doesn't really work the way people thought it's going to work.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're totally right. And I think, like, increasingly, like, um, especially Americans are very allergic to, restraints of any kind. People really freak out, right? Um, and then when they encounter any sort of obstacle, any kind of friction, and this is something we talked about in our first conversation, it's like an existential issue. Um, and we never talk about, well, what are we losing um, as we become more frictionless? Like, what friction are we introducing? And it's like the friction of interacting with, like, one another, right? Like, we're just it's too hard. Like we're all sort of like constantly staring at a mirror. And if what we see in the mirror doesn't match what other people see, right? It's like we lose our minds. And I think that's true of everyone. There's certain groups who are a little bit more extreme with it, but I think those are just like the poster children of issues that are very widespread.
Yeah, and I feel like there's also this kind of almost knee-jerk reaction of you don't really want limits to be imposed on yourself, so you just make that a rule for everything. And I see a lot of people just willingly, almost like gambling away civilization wholesale on the idea that you don't want to be the shitty guy saying, okay, up to here and no more, because you're afraid that someone else will come in and tell you up to here and no more, and that this whole world of this whole free for all is going to collapse because there's going to it's a domino thing where rules will have to come in, and I really see that, like, that feels to me like the biggest pushback that I get from people. They're like, okay, who's gonna be doing this, and under what right, what's their jurisdiction?
Yeah, like who's what ethics board is going to be deciding? I mean, I think it's like, you know, at some point, and Indian Bronson does a good job at saying this. Like, yeah, some people need to be collateral damage, right? Like,
Yeah,
nobody wants to say that, because like when especially like person to person, and whether it's on Twitter or in real life, and someone's like, well, what about my lifestyle? Like, are you going to say I can't do this? You like me, and you have to just have the gumption to say yes, yeah, I even you, and
yeah.
or like even
Back in the
myself.
closet you go. Yeah, I think that's the reality of it. I mean, I really do see people taking it almost impossibly hard to see fallout from the imposition of order. Like you can see, San Francisco, turning into like a public toilet, and all of these cities descending into mob violence and all this type of stuff. That's kind of a consequence of disorder. No one's actually there saying, putting in limits and stuff like that. But even like, for example, with the discussions about abortion, they come in with these edge cases. Like if there's a 10-year-old girl who was raped and things like that, and that girl would be kind of the fallout of the imposition of order. No one's really talking about, millions of babies who, never even have a chance to be born, and, maybe die in horrific conditions, depending on what your idea is about, human life. That's not as important as this one individual who might be constrained by the imposition of order. So, and Indian Bronson also has this really good example about prisons. He's has this thing where he wants to triple the prison population, which I do agree with in many ways. So, yeah, I think it's to get a certain civilizational outcome, there has to be collateral damage, and yeah, it's just unacceptable.
Well, I mean, I think people also like misweigh the importance of certain things, or of certain possibilities. Like, like having, speaking of edge cases, like the polyamorous rationalist family, right, who lives on a commune. Like, oh, well, you're not okay with that. Well, first of all, like what ends up happening is you have hundreds of thousands of people doing a half-assed version of that terribly and fucking up their lives. So just right off the bat, the people who are doing it correctly, quote unquote, like are, it's like, well, why are their feelings so important? Like, who gives a fuck? Yeah, to do it in secret if you have to do it. If this is really who you are and it's so important to you, just make it a counterculture. It'll be more fun, like.
Yeah. And the idea that, these unions and all this type of stuff have to be legally recognized and brought to equality with marriage, uh, that's a little bit insane because, marriage has a certain societal function. It's organized around the principle of procreation. You're going to have children, of sharing property, of consolidating certain roles. These are all pro-social goals that the state wants to incentivize. Other types of unions don't essentially, they don't correspond to these parameters. They're not going to promote all this stuff. Like, for example, a polyamorous union, excuse my polyamorous followers, in its essence has a different orientation. It's not there to have children. Your purpose there is not to further your name. it's to have access to multiple sex partners. It's in the title, that's kind of the purpose of it. It's polyamorous. We're amorous with a poly mix of people. So, yeah, I mean, the fact that the state doesn't want to incentivize this is normal.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I do. One interesting thing is I do see people sort of slowly being like, actually, like, the impact on those communities is that, like, they can't gatekeep as effectively, and that dilutes the purposes of those communities. And the stigma is part of the gatekeeping, and this is true with anything, right? Like this. I mean, this is what the, like, sort of right wing hot topic sort of participation trophy rhetoric of 2004 was all about, right? Like, if make it open to everyone, then it becomes meaningless, and then it turns into this slop, and then it's like even people who are finding refuge in these communities can no longer do that. So it just kind of eventually the whole system destroys itself. If everything's open to everyone, that even impacts the people who are like, well, what about me? The collateral damage argument.
Yeah, there's been quite a lot of tensions around gatekeeping recently, and what exactly where are the edges of the dissident right, and who can join, who can be friends with us or with them, depending on where you draw the
Right.
line. So yeah, it's been quite interesting to observe. But I think you're right. I think people really are underselling the gatekeeping function. Like, it's not a pure negative. There is a certain need to gatekeep certain, I don't know if it's like subversive ideas, but like just, certain things that just don't belong to the memeplex of the
Right. Well,
you know
we don't have boundaries around anything, right? Like, another great thing that, like you say often, is like dating is a coordination problem. Like, nobody knows what dating is. That's like a symptom of there's no boundaries. We don't have boundaries between like work life and home life, or like what's appropriate to tell your boss. And all of those things make, and those are very like micro examples, but like, that makes ghosting possible. That makes all sorts of like rude behavior that you can't address. And then then it becomes, you have to like create these weird like HR scripts that could, one use for every situation, because you don't know where you stand with anyone. But it's really, it's really the same issue. Ultimately, it's just, that's what it looks like when you take it away on even mundane things like talking to your boss, or whatever.
yeah, it feels to me like you've been exposed to the bring your whole self to work culture.
I used to write, write emails to big tech company. I mean, used to work at a very big tech company. And, part of this boundary collapse, right, was that HR somehow became part of my marketing job. And I'd have to, write to all the ERGs about, you got to bring your whole self to work. Be like, we've seen your Twitter, DF. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
That
I
would have been
think
a nightmare.
I think it also ties into the fact that, with other bonds, collapsing, work is almost a necessary place where we're supposed to be finding fulfillment. That's where the money comes from. That's where you get to buy stuff. That's where, your status comes from. And I think bring your whole self to work is just the fact that people really didn't feel any familial connection with their families anymore, or very little of it, having moved away. And then they're like, okay, we can make work a family. You just need to
Well, what's
be really
disturbing about
honest.
that is no one actually does feel like their office is a family. They feel like it's this terrible imposition. And at
Yeah.
best, it distracts them, right? People like will dive, headfirst into their jobs, but I think like, no one's like, these are my best friends. They're like, this is a weird skin I wear because it's just, life is too empty and depressing without it. And there's like, they're like, they almost know what's going on, but not quite.
What's really interesting, because I used to work in kind of a more normal. This is also in tech, but like a normal, more like hierarchical organization in a shitty job, which actually is a benefit to making friends at work, because you can all ally against the shittiness of the job, of the boss, of whatever circumstances you're in. And then I could actually have to say that my work colleagues were my best friends at that point. I had also just recently moved to a new location, so that worked. But in the more, in the higher up region and the flat hierarchy and the bring yourself to work type of thing, like that was it was very strange because almost the point of the organization was to better my life. The work was incidental in a way, and it felt really shitty to be like, coordinating around problems at work because theoretically there were no problems. And if there were problems, you just, start writing your own laws and, you can change them all. And it felt like strangely oppressive to not be able to, find allies. It was almost like, eunuchs at, I don't know, the Ottoman court, just all whisper campaigns, just like weird gossip stuff. Everything was shrouded in HR language. Very, very strange place. And like psychically, hard to tolerate for me. I don't know. I'm sure some people found it comfortable or better than, a normal hierarchy. But for me and a few people that I know, it was a strange liminal space to be in.
Well, I mean, it's like, would you rather have rules that everyone knows, right? And I mean, here's the beauty of rules that everyone knows. You know which rules you could break and how to break them if you really got to do your own thing, right? So, I mean, it works both ways. Not having any rules and then getting sucker punched if you piss off the wrong person is so much worse, right? You find that like these startups, or like I worked at an ad agency that was like this, that are like kind of like anything goes. It's like the pettiest, just like insane, you know, you wake up one morning and like your manager has been accused of something that you didn't even know was, against whatever, like unethical or whatever the accusation is. I mean, these things, like, it's so much better to like know, have there be like a static right and wrong. And that way you can still disagree with it, but that's so, like this is what we're all agreeing on, as like this is the anchor point. But when it's just nothing, it's super disorienting. And people also like withdraw, which is another reaction to that, because like why risk it in some cases?
Yeah, and it's interesting because you kind of highlight a point where the most insane people take the reins in these situations. Like they really like strong, personality, especially people who are very woke. And know that there will be no pushback to whatever excesses of this they try to impose. They go off the rails, and they can go and go and go because there is no one to stop them. And like I mean, like the examples I've lived through, it's just like the level of subversion that you can get to from that is just insane. And the leadership has nothing to do because they essentially kind of agree with the fact that you make your own rules. And two, they're probably also pretty woke as well because, this is the kind of organization they've built. So they're just, standing there. Like, people don't get fired for like half a decade because no one knows, what levers to pull, to oust these insane people. So it's a strange thing to observe.
Yeah, it is super weird. And then like different popularity games. I mean, I was just talking to my friend about this yesterday. He asked me to shout him out, so I was talking to Soso about this yesterday. It sets people up to fail too, right? Because then like the other thing that ends up happening is you have all these weird like DEI initiatives, and you just hire random people to fill quotas. There's no path for them, no rules, right? So you have like random people who like you're just putting there to look good. They can't move up, they can only move down. You can't fire them because you've tokenized them. I mean, it's not fair to them. It's not fair to anyone at the organization.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's exactly what happens. Like, they're just people who, at some point don't even show up to work because they just know they don't have to, or they just do minimal type of work. And then if anyone says anything, they're just completely hurt, and they show you that they have leverage over you and say, actually how I do my job is none of your business. So it's really, yeah, it's fun to watch. I am happy that I've never actually been in like leadership in any of these companies because I would have probably had a mental breakdown at one point. But yeah, I
Oh,
probably
that's the
wouldn't have.
worst.
Yeah.
As a manager, I would be like, I would just tell people like straight up, I was like, look, I know you guys got like randomly picked at some college career fair. You don't want to be here. You're kind of tough to manage. How about this? Tell me, I'll pick up some of the slack for you. and we can make this work one way or another. But I know there's no way that you're going to dive in to the deep end here. And I just like wouldn't keep up the charade. And I remember I worked one place where I managed this woman. She got moved to another manager, and she was like, "How do you deal with her? She's like so disorganized." And I was like, just kind of like help her out, whatever. And then that manager tried to like be real with her, but like wasn't delicate enough, and she got into so much trouble. Felt so bad for giving her that advice. But I mean, that's really the only I think that's like the only like humane thing to do, right? Just like be like, look, I don't know, I can't help you.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like the tide is turning for that as well. I mean, it just seeing people go through those experiences. I mean, they do tend to soften the flat hierarchy to make it a little bit sharper than it used to be. But I don't think the people take the right lessons from this stuff. They just think they need to try harder. They need to implement the stuff a bit better. But anyway, I wanted to kind of focus on another of your strengths. It's trend forecasting. Is there any internet related trend that people haven't really felt yet, or is on the horizon? Something you've felt with your spidey senses is coming?
Yeah. So I do think like tech criticism is going to be big. I mean, it already is, right? But I think it's going to be like people are going to recognize it as a genre of like hot take. Um, I see a lot of people mentioning McLuhan, so I kind of think that what Lash and Polya are to the hip young intellectuals today, McLuhan and Postman and people of that genre will be to the Zoomers of tomorrow. Um, and sort of hand in hand with that, I do think there's a lot of like hot take burnout. So you see this on TikTok a lot, like these sort of like meta analyses of trends, right? So it's so much easier to like if you're going to have this sort of like we're going to start like breaking things down, just focus on like what explaining why things are trending. And it's really easy to do this with like fashion, but food, sort of going back and explaining these things, and then trying to predict what the next one is going to be, because that's sort of a safe space. And if you're burnt out on like whatever gender ideology or whatever the culture war topic du jour is, that is a refuge. And it's sort of a growing, sort of like a growing genre, I think. And it's for the people who are like, I don't know, I'm not left, I'm not right. But what was up with everyone wearing lame mini skirts in 2008?
Yeah, that really makes a lot of sense, because I feel like even I haven't really been in these cycles for long enough, but even I kind of see that there is a certain pattern to things. There's a certain kind of periodicity to things spiking, then coming down. The different schisms, and how like you said, how kind of conspiracy theories take off. Where you kind of have a few ingredients in there, and then that goes up, then it comes down, then it maybe comes back in 2 or 3 more waves, and what it's based on. Sometimes I also have insider knowledge about these things. I know these people, so it's you kind of see how the sausage is made, and it's easier to have that meta view and to not kind of get roped into things as much. I feel like that's kind of also a reason why I haven't been, I mean, also time constraints and just life in general has led me here, but I haven't really been as involved in the cycles anymore. I tend to not take them as seriously. I don't know. Is
Yeah,
that me being?
I'm going through that too. Like, I just like I think like as of the last couple of weeks, I'm like I just don't have anything to say. Right? I'm just like
Yeah.
I think like I just like got burnt out on it. Right? Like I was just on it like on every little issue. But I think like after the Kiwi Farms thing, I was like I'm done. I don't have a single take I could offer, and I just like don't have the energy or the desire. I feel like I need to go into like hibernation. And I feel like a lot of people are, I mean, you're feeling that, as you just mentioned, a lot of people are, it's been a weird sort of like, you know, ebbing of the culture wars. But I think I think this election cycle is going to be very interesting because people are getting meaner and people are getting angrier. And like, if, people thought 2016 was weird, I think it's going to be so much weirder, 2024.
Yeah, maybe also because of the burnout. I feel like, that kind of takes away the more moderate people and just leaves the crazies in in
Yeah.
full battle gear.
Well, also we know that like anything's kind of possible now. Like there's no
Yeah.
sort of like, that can't happen. Well, no, I mean anything could happen, right? Like we don't know there's no sort of like the simulation's off the rails.
Yeah, exactly. Purple Caesar, I think, a preferable global purple Caesar. Oh no. Yeah. I mean, this is all super fascinating. I mean, the Adam Lanza stuff. I mean, I've just been listening to things, from you, from other people about this, and it really does feel like it's just, you know, almost a prophet of our times in a strange way. Someone who's maybe so aspy that he could just peel away all the layers of the kind of the ruling ideology, and what there is kind of this gaping hole that he let himself fall into and took a lot of people with him. But some other people, like myself included, can just kind of intuit the outline of the abyss, and we're pulling back, we're going back to religion, doing all sorts of things and trying to compensate for that, but it's there. And I feel like, yeah, that's, for me, that's a big trend, people noticing the abyss a little bit more than usual.
Oh yeah, I mean I totally agree with that. Or people saying like, look, I understand why you're returning, but we can't, and I'm dead inside. That's also a big trend, which is sad. I shouldn't laugh, but like that, I think that's it's two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, you're just, seeing reality as it is, and how you deal with it. There's personal preference in some ways. Before I let you go, I want to ask you the question of the show. If you have an updated answer to this, because last time I
Oh
forgot
my
to
god.
update your answer, but actually it wasn't that bad an answer, and I'll tell the listeners if they forgot
Oh
about it.
no.
It is
No.
Justin Murphy is a
Okay,
good
yeah,
one. I like
he's
Justin
great.
Murphy, and
Yeah.
and Paul Scalise. I mean, since then there have been more scandals around Paul Scalise. He is an insightful guy, though I haven't really been following him because he blocked me almost instantly the second I hit the internet for some reason, and
Because
then
he probably
unblocked
steals your
me a few
shit.
times. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Okay, I'll say of Paul Scalise, even though we are enemies now, I will say that he may not be an original thinker, but he's an excellent curator.
Yeah,
Um,
he is.
but my new thinkers are Sherry Turkle, who I quote all the time. She's great. Humdog, who was a pseudonymous writer. Her essays are sort of scattered throughout the internet. Pandora's Vox is like if you want to know about internet culture, that is an excellent starting place. Marshall McLuhan and my friend Clinton Ignatov, who actually writes for my Substack now. His explainers on Marshall McLuhan, because McLuhan is not easy to understand raw, if you will. So that's my updated list.
Yeah, how things have changed
Yeah.
since like a year and a half ago. Yeah, but I think many internet revelations. The internet's changed like 5 times since we spoke. Maybe even many more times if one counts all the subgenres of internet that have
Oh
existed in
my
the
god.
meantime.
Yeah. Just constant schisms. It's so I thought I would never get bored watching it. And now I'm like, I'm done. The weather's beautiful. Climate change means it's 80 degrees in October in Chicago. I may as well enjoy it.
Yeah, yeah, just watching the apocalypse out the window. Yeah, I think you'll be back. You can't stay away for long.
That's
It's
true.
also your beat. I'm sure.
Yeah.
Internet history is one thing, but internet present, there's lots of stuff to be
That's the
seen.
one. Yeah. I have to be the one contrarian voice on that.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Catherine. This has been lovely as always, and I want to point people to your Substack. It's defaultfriend.substack.com. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. And is there any? You also have a podcast called The Computer Room, which people should check out. It's also
Yes, and
extremely
it's
good.
yeah, and we're putting out episodes again, and I have a whole bunch of episodes coming out, so I'm excited.
Excellent, excellent. Please do listen to it if you're as fascinated as I am about this, demonic technology that has, possessed us all. It's wonderful and scary at the same time. And Catherine's the best person to go for information on our common plight. So thank you so much, Catherine. This has been delightful.
Thank you.